Hello, my name is John Paul, and today we're going to be talking about two very interesting books. First is Dangerous Games by Margaret Macmillan, and the second is Silencing the Past by Michael Rolfe Trio. Now, these two books are chiefly concerned with how history is made and told um, and created. Um, More specifically, they are concerned with how silences in our past are created. So, for example, a question that might come up is why do women seem to be lacking from our history books when they make up 50% of our population from the dawn of mankind? And these two books are chiefly concerned with those things. Now, Trio chiefly concerns himself with how these silences come about almost from a the systemic nature of making history. And he identifies four key areas that those kind of stem from. Whereas Margaret Macmillan, in her book, Dangerous Games, The Uses and Abuses of History, is more concerned with how power is introduced to make or abuse history. Both are concerned with how power is concerned with history, but one is more about people in my mind, whereas the other is concerned with the system of making history. So, for example, Macmillan in her writing writes that um, about bad history, quote unquote. Bad history tells only part of complex stories, or it makes sweeping generalizations for which there is not adequate evidence and ignores awkward facts that do not fit. Trio, on the other hand, never makes such a distinction of bad or good history. Rather, he talks about how history is something that exists within the public domain. Um, Now, um, the fundamental issue that they're getting at is that there is inherently a difference between what truly happened in the past and everything that exists within the sphere of history and how we tell it. And so we as observers of history have to be wary of how history is told to us because it is presented as the truth when it never can ultimately get up to that. So, for example, Trio, his four key areas that he writes about are number one, the creation of sources, the making of archives, number two, um, how events become facts when they're retrieved, and finally, number four, um, when retrospective significance itself is produced by making a narrative from these. And in each of those four steps, Trio discusses how silences are inherently introduced by the system of literally making history. Macmillan, on the other hand, as I said, talks about bad or good history and how history falls into one of three categories that arguments are often made. So, in her example, she's talking about land possession and she identifies a strategic method or an ethnographic, but her third, which she's making her point off of, is that a historical argument is often made by people in order to achieve an end. So it introduces a bias in the fact that history is very often used with an end in mind. I thought a great example of this and how biases are naturally introduced in like discussion is the first of which was our reading on Tecumseh, which is a Indian writer, when he talks about how the settlers are feeble and they could do nothing for themselves, and yet the same narrative but put on the other side by Las Casas, he describes them as their delicate constitutions make them unable to withstand hard work or suffering and render them liable to succumb to almost any illness. So here are these two people that are simultaneously talking about each other as feeble, and yet we remember one of the other as more powerful than the other. And so I think this is a great example of how two different perspectives naturally just bring their biases into the discussion. Um, So furthermore, um, kind of what I got out of this reading is how um, we as history observers and historians have to basically address these issues. So Trio brings up these systemic problems that result. So I think his call to action is for historians primarily, because historians make history, they have to keep in mind that their process of retrieval and retrospective like consideration inherently brings in biases in the writing, and they should acknowledge that and use that to critique their work and acknowledge these biases to inform the reader. Um, Macmillan, on the other hand, the issue that I got out of her book is that historians have a special role to play in their ability to critique um, histor- um, historical argumentation that is used within the public sphere. Um, However, I found myself more and more agreeing with Trio's belief that anyone has access to history. Specifically, he writes that history does not belong to only its narrators, professionals, or amateurs. And furthermore, he also writes that, excuse me, that status as historian is not confirmed by an academic doctoral degree, but by a mixture of publications that conform to a large extent to the standard of the Western Guild, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, there's no such thing as one person that's allowed to tell history, which I think ultimately in the sphere of what history has been made by, as much as Macmillan may disagree with it, history will continue to be made by both historians and the common man. And therefore, an informed history teller can keep both of these things, avoiding abuse and the systemic problems that result from making history in mind to tell a responsible history. Um, Overall, I think these are the key concepts that I pulled from these readings, and it instilled a great respect for how history is told in our country and across the world. Thank you.